So I'm dialing in from Wurundjeri Woi country, here near the beautiful Mary Creek, and I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and also, given the context of this network and all of the work that you do, acknowledge the disproportionate impact that colonisation has had on First Nations people across both the justice system and also in accessing equitable healthcare. So that includes 24/7 secure refuge for families escaping family violence, transitional housing, outreach support, so that's case management and other supports while families are recovering in the community, therapeutic support, legal support, and early intervention, which is what I'm going to talk to you all about today. So we've been fortunate to be around for 50 years doing our work, and we're currently really focused on cycle breaking intervention. So getting in early to identify high-risk children and supporting them to recover from family violence. So I'll give a little bit of data just to start the conversation, and you're probably all very familiar with a lot of this, but family violence is endemic in Australia. It is one of the most common crimes, one of the most underreported crimes, and it's very, very likely that in the work that you do, you'd see a lot of intersection between the clients we work with and the clients you work with. So, as you'd all know, really high numbers of Australian adults have experienced physical or family violence, and really, really high numbers of children have experienced family violence. And studies, including studies by the AIFS, have identified that really high proportions of children have been exposed to family violence. It's the most common type of childhood maltreatment in our community. It has a really significant impact on children. And I wanted to start this conversation around the data by identifying that it's only very recently that we've started to collect data and understand the impact of family violence on children, on their development, on their outcomes, on their access to things like education and healthcare, and on their long-term well-being and ability to participate in the community. So a lot of this data we've only started collecting recently, and even more recently understanding it. And within our system, we still count only the woman. So if you come through the family violence system in Victoria and most of the country, whether you're a single woman on her own or, a person with multiple children, you will be one unit. So even in the data and the record keeping and the funding streams, children still aren't seen within the system, despite, at least at our service, being the majority of clients at any time. About 2/3 of the clients we work with are children. So 1 in 3 people in Victoria, when there's a police call out for family violence, are children. And on the evidence base, the strongest predictor that a child will use violence is exposure to violence at home. So we now understand really clearly that is the big risk factor for a child growing up to use violence. And we know that the impact of violence is really, really profound. And when we talk about development and children's development, you'd all know that first 100 days and that critical first 5 years are incredibly foundational in that child's outcomes, that child's ability to regulate, to form healthy pro-social relationships, to form secure attachment, and then down the road to be able to participate in school, form healthy social relationships, and then have healthy and safe adult relationships. So the impact is profound. And then going back to the data I shared before around family violence being the most common form of childhood maltreatment, we're talking about one of the most profound and unaddressed factors in our community for long-term children's outcomes. So I now want to talk about the link between violence, maltreatment, and youth offending. If you're in Victoria, you might have seen there's a lot in the news and the media right now about particularly youth offending. And it's been really, really heavily politicised, and we have a tough on crime agenda. I just wanted to caveat this by saying, this is not about kind of penalising children. This is around identifying the risk factors that may lead to offending behaviours. So if you look at the youth justice data and the childhood maltreatment data, we see a really, really strong link between family violence, childhood maltreatment, and youth offending. So about half of the people who offend, so that is children who are convicted of a crime, have already had contact with police as a victim survivor of family violence. And again, that's only the children where there's actually been police intervention. So this is a really underreported crime. So the research notes that we're probably talking about much, much higher numbers. If you look at the data for adults, about 75% of people who have been arrested in their lifetimes have experienced childhood maltreatment. And if you look at chronic multi-type maltreatment, that's different forms of exposure to childhood maltreatment. So, for example, abuse, neglect, physical violence. So if you experience those types of things over a long time, you're 3.5 times more likely if you're a young man to be imprisoned. So we're seeing a stream. There is a run through from the system I work in to the justice system. And a story that I tell often is my last job was a human rights review of the Victorian prison system. And I was really lucky to go in for a number of years and sit down and talk to people in custody about their experiences of the custodial system, why they were there, and their rehabilitation. And over those years, every single person I spoke to had experienced childhood maltreatment, every single one. So they'd been through our systems that had multiple opportunities for intervention, and then they'd ended up in prison. So we need to do more along the way, early as possible. And the data is very, very clear. The system intervenes too late, as I've been saying. There's a real lack of early intervention embedded into my system, the specialist family violence system. We're waiting until these children grow up, become teenagers, and offend. And then it is an intervention while a child is in the justice system. But on the data, we can see these behaviours escalate in early childhood and primary school. But in that period, that critical early childhood period, we don't have very many interventions available within the system. And the only tool in the schooling system's toolkit is often suspension or expulsion when these kids present with these big challenging behaviours, particularly in the classroom. And a really troubling data point is 100% of kids who are expelled from a Victorian primary school will end up with a justice system interaction. That's, I think, one of the most chilling data points I've heard. So these kids are coming through and we're failing them, and it becomes a justice response. So why we've focused on cycle breaking early intervention, we saw lots and lots of kids come through our services. So they were coming through refuge, they were coming through outreach, and they were accessing supports, but the behaviours were escalating. They were being excluded from school. At home, the safe caregiver, who was most usually mum, was really struggling with the challenging behaviours, and they were ending up with police interactions. And so we saw the link and we said we had to do something to understand the pathways and to draw on the evidence base to create and embed early intervention. And obviously, we've stood on the shoulders of incredible researchers and practitioners who've come before us who've been saying this for a really long time. And I've got a quote here from the Pippa Project and Elena Campbell, who we're very lucky to work with. And in that Pippa Project in 2020, they said very clearly across Australia, they interviewed practitioners across the jurisdictions they were working with, and they all said, looking at adolescents who use violence, that the intervention should have happened 10 years before. So we're trying to address that gap and look at early childhood and particularly primary age children. So we did a big literature review. We got in some incredible practitioners and experts. We were very lucky to secure philanthropic funding to run our pilot year, and we launched in early 2025. So I wanted to give you guys a bit of a sense of the demand, the kids who came through in year one. So we had a total of 76 participants come through those first two pilot cohorts. So the kids were between 3 and 14. We were giving them a service response in age-appropriate cohorts. So there was an early childhood, an early primary, and a late primary, early high school cohort in our 2 semester-long programs. Every single kid had experienced and witnessed family violence. Usually we just say experience because your nervous system, when you're a child, doesn't really distinguish between seeing it happen in the family home and experiencing it yourself. All had been through our system at least once, and many of them had been through multiple times. And the parents were saying to us, we don't know what to do. We love our children. We're seeing the behaviors deteriorate, and we have no mechanism to respond to them. We don't know how to parent them. And the parents are really, really traumatized as well. And often, just like the children, these parents have experienced intergenerational trauma, multi-type maltreatment, and often had had more than one violent partner as an adult. So you're talking about trauma across the family, and that impairs your ability to develop safe, secure attachment with your child, which we know is one of the foundational indicators of childhood well-being and healthy childhood outcomes. So these kids were pretty distressed and their behaviors were pretty big. I won't go into detail because it is pretty upsetting, but we had really little kids hurting their siblings with weapons, using weapons at school. And I say weapons knowing that, anything can be used as a weapon. Almost all the kids were using physical violence towards their siblings. We had kids smashing up homes, smashing up the classroom. And a really common thing that they had was when your nervous system is really impaired by trauma, there's a very short window between being okay and not being okay. So these kids are explosive, small things, small conflicts, and small kind of perceptions of unsafety would set off their nervous system. And so, in the classroom, that looks like a kid that will just go off and get really, really dysregulated and violent with their body. And so these kids were being excluded from school at really, really high numbers. And school is a crucial protective factor. Participation in school and engagement in the classroom is so critical for a kid's outcomes. And these kids were just dropping out of school, being lost by the system. And something that you may know about the specialist family violence system is that the mechanism that we use, which is not great, but we remove often mum and the kids from their community. They come to refuge or transitional or crisis housing. They have to leave school, they leave communities, and they're going to a different school. So already these kids are isolated. They've been transplanted in an unfamiliar community. And then these behaviours are increasing, and the school doesn't know how to respond to them. The classroom teacher doesn't necessarily have the capabilities or the training, often a lot of goodwill and a lot of really beautiful intentions, but none of the tools in their toolbox. So, most of these kids were having a really, really tough time. And for the safe caregivers, they had nowhere to go. We had parents who were calling police and calling child protection, pleading for people to remove their children because they didn't know how to parent them and they were really frightened for themselves, for the child's siblings, and for the child. So this is, really gutting circumstances for the entire family. I also wanted to pick up a really interesting and unexpected thing that we saw. Really, really high proportions of these kids were either already diagnosed with neurodiversity or were in the process of being assessed. So I've got the data up there. So the kids who are using the physical violence, 100% of them were either diagnosed with a form of neurodiversity or were in that process. So there is a link there between trauma and neurodiversity that we're going to explore, but I thought it was a really interesting data point. And there's similar data emerging from the justice system and youth justice as well. What did the program actually do? So it worked with the whole family, understanding that you needed to address trauma with the whole family with a goal of building safe and attuned relationships, particularly between the parent and the child and the parent and their safe caregiver. The model is a family model, but we work with the children in groups, with the focus being that children's groups, age-appropriate groups, help kids to relate to other children who have been through similar things. It's a really isolating experience to come through the specialist family violence system, and the kids developed community. And through those groups, those supportive facilitated groups run by specialist practitioners, they learned things like co-regulation, forming healthy relationship, rupture and repair, how to navigate conflict through evidence-based therapeutic intervention. Separately, the mums came together and they worked on addressing and processing shame. these participants carried significant amounts of shame from their experiences of violence and trauma, and also to understand what trauma had done, not just to their children, but their own nervous systems, relationship with others, and their own self-esteem, and help the women to understand through, again, evidence-based models of psychosocial education, how to repair ruptured relationships, how to co-regulate, and how to respond to these really, really big behaviors. And part of the work, it's about cycle breaking, not just for the kids. So these children are at the highest risk, the cohorts in the community, of both using violence, but also becoming re-victimized, for then their first, teenage or early adulthood romantic partner to be using violence, but also for the parents. Their next relationship, even if it wasn't with the same person using violence, is also highly, highly likely to be with somebody using violence. And that's because we learn models of relationship, and often we will seek the same model of relationship, even if it's been unsafe, even if it's been harmful. This is the cycle of violence. So we're trying to address it both in mum and the children. So I've already gone through this, but a critical part of the work when we built the foundations in group work, so given the kids and the mums that kind of really core capabilities around regulation and healthy attachment and rupture and repair, we then went to dyadic work. So that means mum and child come together and they have therapy together. And that helps them to address relational trauma and learn how to co-regulate and learn how to respond to big, big behaviors. And that has to be underpinned by obviously really rigorous safety screening, because these are still families at really high risk of harm. Therapeutic case management. That means linking the families into all the other things that are critical for recovery, like housing, like legal support, like accessing things like the NDIS and Medicare, and also clinical supervision for the team. So making sure that they're supported to do the best work that they can in a really stressful and difficult environment with kids with really big behaviors. So support for the team went along the way, including expert external supervision by clinical practitioners. Outcomes. So we knew that our program was only as good as the evaluation, and that evaluation had to be done at arm's length. So we got the wonderful Elena Campbell and her team at RMIT CIJ to evaluate the whole first year. And these are some of the outcomes. So the report is coming, we're hoping, next month, which is very exciting, but this draws from some of those outcomes. So we had an average of 90% completion across both cohorts, which was pretty excellent. Of the kids that participated, every single child either demonstrated a significant de-escalation of the aggressive and challenging behaviours, or they stopped. All of the kids re-engaged with school, which was pretty phenomenal. Again, school being the critical protective factor for these kids. That was different for every kid. Some of them meant that they had an adaptive learning plan, so they were able to dial in or go a few days a week. Others were totally back in the classroom, but coming from the beginning where we had really high levels of school avoidance, suspension, and expulsion, that was a pretty phenomenal outcome. And all caregivers reported that their houses were safer. So going home was a safer place. And that's such a critical enabler for a family recovering from family violence, because if you have a dysregulated kid at home who's using violence, your ability to participate, in get a job, go out of the house with your child, connect with your community is really, really impaired. And it means your own trauma is going to, also impact outcomes. So those outcomes are really, really phenomenal. And I wanted to touch on, the program itself is just building on the evidence that's already there. We weren't creating any new kind of therapeutic interventions. We were drawing from evidence-based models that already existed. It was just about embedding it in the right place with a really high risk cohort. The RMIT-CIJ evaluation has picked up what's really worked in this program and why it was effective. Working with the whole of family was critical. You can't isolate a family member, especially when the kids are little. You need to address the impact of trauma and relational impairment with all family members. Developing really safe relationships with the practitioners was critical. They had to be specialists. They had to be okay with kids who use really, really big behaviors. That's confronting. It requires a bit of experience and training, and the staff were just phenomenal. Child inclusive practice is crucial because the system, as I said, still doesn't really recognize the child as a person. So the program and the work around it had to acknowledge that children are victim survivors and people and individuals in their own right, with their own wishes, with their own values. They're not always going to align with mums. And it's really, really important that we see the child as a person, as an individual. And then supportive case management was crucial. So it had to be via a service response. So, the case managers or practitioners from refuge would pick up that support to navigate a really, really tricky system, of allied health and school and crisis services and housing. So you had that wraparound support so that other things weren't getting in the way of that therapeutic recovery. I wanted to touch on the gaps, as I'm sure that you very clever people have already seen them. There are kids in the system at a really, really high risk of harm that aren't currently eligible for the program. The first is children that don't have a safe caregiver, super duper common in our system where both parents are using violence and the program isn't appropriate for a child where mum is also using violence towards the kid. That's about 25% of the clients that come through our system. Kids in out-of-home care where there is no caregiver at all. And obviously those kids are at really, really high risk of justice system intervention. And also kids who are still living at home with the person using violence. And that's a really challenging one. Our system, as I said before, is built on removing the children, removing the family from home. About 90% of people want to remain with the PUV. They just want the violence to stop. But our system is built around, that 10% who do leave. And so it's very, very difficult to provide therapeutic intervention if children are going home and seeing those same behaviours modelled. So these are significant gaps both within our program and across the system that we're aware of and we're actively looking to respond to. This is the final slide. So I just wanted to touch kind of on our broader advocacy. So we're advocating to both state and federal government for reform to make child-centred early intervention a permanent part of the specialist family violence system. Critical is embedding child-centred care. So every child gets their own service response. Every child is seen as an individual and a victim survivor in their own right. That needs to be structural in terms of the funding model, in terms of how we collect data across the system and how we count, system churn and report on our performance to government. It also needs to be systemic, so embedding a response that builds organisational design around children. So you can have your own case manager as a child, and it's a different case manager to mum. So you have that advocacy built in within the system. And it also needs to be organisational and strategic, so a commitment to child-centred practice that acknowledges the fundamental human rights of every child. As I've said, embedding early intervention to the specialist family violence system, we know that there is a strong link between the cycles of violence, experiencing violence, youth justice, and our system. And we need to embed this work so that we're actually addressing the churn. It's a national commitment, so we need the levers to pull to be able to respond to the kids in the system who are at the highest risk. Building system capability, so not just to identify these kids who are at high risk and be able to understand the behaviour and the intersection between mum's outcomes and well-being and their child's, but also to uplift the capability of practitioners to work effectively with children. There are incredible, incredible practitioners in the system, but often they're trained on working with adults, and that's a huge, huge gap. And I've got equity of access and outcomes here, and that's critical. So intersectional disadvantage really, really impacts the families that we work with. For example, at the moment, about 20% of our clients are First Nations people. About half of them are from migrant and refugee backgrounds, and really high rates of them also are people living with disability. And we know that across all systems, they get poorer outcomes. And so we need to address inequality of outcomes and inequality of access within our system and ensure that everybody, irrespective of their background, is able to access the same services and the same service outcomes. So these are the big things that we're advocating to government for. back on track as part of that broader advocacy. Whew. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Claire. That's incredible and very important work, and no doubt very challenging work too. Very timely with what the Violence Reduction Unit is aiming to do in Victoria at the moment. So we do have some time for questions. I'll invite people to put their camera on if they're willing to. I'd love to see your faces. But if anyone has any questions or comments for Claire, please go ahead. There's still Zoom applause emojis going on, Claire, so I take that as a good sign. Dino.
Hi, Claire. Thanks so much. That was really, really powerful. Um, well, following up on our conversations in Canberra, what I'd be really interested is your thinking around scalability. It's really great that you've done the external evaluation, and those findings are really powerful as well. But I'd love to just know what your thoughts are around scaling.
Sure. So we're really committed to getting this embedded across the specialist family violence system and surrounding systems. And this has to be about embedding the program and the capability within services rather than us scaling and being the providers. So that's about making sure that every service response, irrespective of the postcode lottery about where you get allocated across the Victorian system, is equipped to be able to respond to your child and to give that child the service it needs. We've done a lot of modeling around scale cost, and it's pretty cost effective for a family. Assuming a family presents with two kids, it's about 18 grand per family. So, and if you look at kind of avoided costs, for example, a justice bed across Australia, the average is about $1.2 million a year, which is super duper high for youth justice. In Victoria, it's far higher. Equally, the cost of out of home care is really, really high. That's not to say that obviously, every child who experiences violence does not become a perpetrator, but we know that almost every perpetrator has been a child that's experienced violence. I wanted to make that very clear. But if we actually want to break the cycles of violence in our community, these kind of early intervention investments are critical, and it's such a cost-effective investment. And it's not just about addressing the rates of adolescents and young people using violence, it's also about all of the other outcomes that are impaired by family violence, access to education, health outcomes, all of those different things are addressed by supporting people to recover from trauma. So we're very, very focused on scalability and getting this embedded in our system. And we're advocating both in Victoria and at the federal level to get it embedded in any way we can. Thanks, Dino.
Thanks,
Brilliant. Thank
Claire.
you.
Yeah, look, I mean, considering in Victoria it's well over $2 million a year to incarcerate a child, I can certainly imagine that this is both a good idea and very cost effective. Lindsay.
Hey Claire, thanks so much. That was really interesting. I have a list of questions, but one that's just come to my mind after Dino's asked his question. I'm just curious, like, are there many other groups or organizations working on this issue in Victoria and in Australia? And is there much collaboration between them? Do they have similar approaches? Obviously, the work that you're doing seems to be very impactful, and I was really pleased to see the evaluation. I hope it'll be published. Always a challenge with those to get really large sample sizes, but all that considering, I think you had 75 in that one. That's still great. So hopefully that could even be scaled up as well.
Yeah.
That's my first question, and I will step back
Um,
and see if others have other questions.
yes, there's lots of different therapeutic interventions kind of across the family violence system, but in terms of targeted secondary intervention for this cohort, we weren't we looked and we couldn't find something specifically about kind of justice avoidance and breaking the cycles of violence, especially for primary age children. That's not to say it's not happening somewhere. We might just not be aware of it. And there's beautiful therapeutic work going across the system. But as far as we know, this was the only program in Victoria of its kind. Yeah.
Thanks. And yeah, it seems like a great area for if there's other things happening across Australia to band together and hopefully strengthen the evidence that's available and scalability across different states and territories as well.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, Lindsay. Lee.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. It's great work. Given that the the families and children, there's a high proportion of multiculturalism and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families, I imagine. Does the one approach suit all of those families, or do you have to tailor it in different ways?
That's a great question. And yes, we have to absolutely tailor it, especially for parents where English isn't their first language, and for First Nations communities as well. Getting contact in with ACCOs and making sure that it's a culturally safe and responsive is crucial. Part of our pitches to government are that, you know, for Aboriginal communities particularly, this should be funded for ACCOs to run this program in a way that meets the requirements of their communities and the people that they work with. And I think that's probably critical for multicultural families as well. You know, that this should be run by community, not by, you know, a mainstream organization like ours. And on that, I wanted to pick up something that I didn't mention in the slides. There need to be safe men involved in this work, and that's something we brought in last year. We had a really beautiful program running around alongside Back on Track where it was trauma-informed jiu-jitsu, trauma-informed martial arts, because we realized particularly the little boys, they needed a safe environment to let out that aggression, to, you know, roll around, learn rupture and repair in a way that moved their bodies because that's what they needed to do. And so we got a black belt who had worked with children and did trauma-informed jiu-jitsu to run programs for these particularly little boys. And that interface with a safe man was so crucial for these boys' recovery. And I'll tell a little story because it always makes me cry. There was this little boy, he had had a series of quite violent men in his life, and he grew very attached to the martial arts practitioner that was delivering this program. And he had a session shortly after doing the trauma-informed jiu-jitsu. And he said to the practitioner, Panda, who was the jiu-jitsu practitioner, is a nice man. And the practitioner was like, yeah, he's a really, really nice man. And the little boy said, I didn't know men could be nice. And they talked, and this little boy had just thought that because he was a man, that he would not be nice. And that was just a critical hook in his recovery to just have a different, safe male role model. And I think speaks to your point, Lee, that, you know, we need to get people from community, from culture, men involved in this work to be able to, you know, have individual flexible recovery. Sorry, I went a bit off, but I really wanted to tell that story. Yeah.
That's an incredible story. Thanks, Claire. I was getting teary myself, actually. That's really beautiful. Look, there's a couple of comments and questions in the chat. I just might read out. The first one, I think, from Wayne is perhaps more of a comment, but maybe you've got a response. Great presentation, Claire. I'm interested in the clients who had youth justice involvement, particularly those who had started to use violence in their relationships.
Yeah.
Um,
So the oldest kids we had were between 12 and 14. There were only a couple. They had had some police engagement and police involvement, but they hadn't had any romantic relationships yet, or, you know, the violence was predominantly towards siblings or towards mum, a little bit to their peers in the classroom. So I'm sorry, we don't have that data, but absolutely the trajectories were there. A number of the children we were working with, the police knew them. The police had been called out multiple times. And a couple of the parents have been told, you just have to wait until this kid turns 12 and then we can actually do something, which is
yeah,
chilling.
yeah, that says a great deal, doesn't it? There's another one there from Isabella Fian. Do you think the data you found on neurodiversity in children survivors is a true reflection of these diagnoses, or is it possible that it's a result of our systems pathologizing these presentations that may be explained by trauma?
That is such a great question, and something I was lucky to talk to Stuart and his colleagues about a couple of weeks ago. And the short answer is that we don't know. We think that trauma and neurodiversity present with very, very different outward-facing symptoms, especially if you haven't received the treatments that you require. The unfortunate thing is that the mechanism to get the services you need is often a diagnostic pathway that gets you access to the NDIA. So that means that a diagnosis is an enabler. And you're right, it is a form of pathologizing children and pathologizing trauma. But right now, that's the pathway to get, your routine, your speech therapist, and the other interventions that a kid might need that also are going to help with these challenging behaviours. And one of the recommendations of the report is we need to understand this because the data is really clearly telling us that there's some sort of correlation, but we don't know what it is.
Thank you. Great question. And we could probably spend an entire hour talking about that, I suspect, Claire. A question from Lara Sure. Hi, Lara. Is there any reason to believe these stats would be any different in any other state or territory?
Do you mean the stats on kind of the rates of family violence or on the outcomes for the participants,
Uh,
Lara?
I'm not sure if you're able to unmute,
Both, yeah,
Lara, but both,
okay.
both.
Look, I think possibly, we did have unusually high rates of non-diverse children participate in this program, far higher than what we'd see actually coming through our refuge, which was really interesting. And I think if there was more diversity, just because of the inequity of justice responses and the inequity of outcomes within the system, that you might see different outcomes. I think the other thing to point out is that every other state and territory has a very different model for family violence responses. Victoria is probably the highest funded with the most services, from what I understand about the national system. And so when it comes to the supports that are available to families, like access to refuge, like case management responses, it's definitely not perfect. It needs a lot of reform to get better. But from what I know, it is more funded and resourced than other states. So possibly those kind of surrounding enablers, like access to housing and so on, might result in poorer outcomes. But yeah, it's a really fair point.
Mm. And that seems relevant to the question about national scaling of these sorts of approaches, I guess,
Yeah.
Claire. Yeah. Samantha Aiken says another challenge is that the impacts of trauma can sometimes present in ways that are similar to autism spectrum disorder, which can make assessment and support planning more complex.
Totally agree. Yes. And like I said before, like the responses needs are often the same. It's about making sure these kids get access to the services that they need, and often the pathway is some sort of diagnosis, which is,
Mhm.
I think, presents some real challenges, especially with health access and inequality. Yeah.
Indeed. Thanks, Claire. Lindsay.
Thanks, Claire. Me again. I've got a question around, well, two questions around the stat that you provided that 100% of kids expelled end up in justice, which was just shocking to see.
Yeah.
Kind of minor question around that or more detailed is, do you know the source of that? Was that
Yes,
state
that was
national data? Was that survey data?
yeah, it was conducted via the EY, Ernst and Young. So I can send out that research if you're interested. It's a really, really shocking statistic and something that the Department of Education and our colleagues there are aware of and are looking at better intervention to keep primary age children in schools. But yeah, it's really, really shocking. 100% is
Mm.
terrible.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd love to see that. I can also just Google it, but if you
Yeah, no,
want to send
happy
it
to
through, that'd
send
be
it around.
great.
Yeah.
And then my broader question around that statistic is, do you ever work with schools in terms of intervention? And I'm just curious around your thoughts of what the role of schools are. The Justice Health Group based at Curtin, and I'm also at Murdoch Children's Research Institute, the Center for Adolescent Health. And there's quite a few people in that group that are interested in health promoting schools, which is looking at schools in various different ways and different facets of education in the system to promote health, which obviously a part of health is violence and safety from violence. I'm just wondering your thoughts around the role of schools and if you do engage with schools in any way.
Yeah, so the program really focuses on support with the school. So working with both the classroom teacher and other practitioners within the school to, first of all, help the school understand what's happening for this family, because often it hasn't been disclosed. And obviously that's with the consent of the family. That's really, really important. But often mum hasn't told school because of, shame, and just worried that her kid's going to be treated differently. So facilitating just that knowledge and understanding, and often that is the start of the school saying, oh, this isn't a bad kid. This is a kid who's had a really, really difficult situation. And they start to work collaboratively with the practitioners, with mum and with the child to be able to better understand and respond to the behaviours. The program also helps the classroom teacher. I mean, there's only a point to which a classroom teacher with 20 other kids in the classroom can, always intervene on time, but to be able to see when the kid's becoming triggered or escalated and help to redirect or give them, another pathway rather than, using their bodies or using their words to hurt themselves or hurt another child. And then there's also tying with the mental health support within the school that's also facilitated by the program. And that's, again, totally critical because almost all these kids were going to school and no one had any idea what this family had gone through. All they could see was a naughty, disruptive kid and an unengaged parent.
And then I would imagine too, as you said with that that story around the young person not realizing that men could be kind, which is just so sad. And the reality too that a lot of young people in these family circumstances won't actually realize that what they're experiencing is not normal and shouldn't be happening. So that general education around, what is family violence and where to go if you're experiencing it seems to be another important element.
Totally.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. Samantha.
I'm hoping that you can hear me because I am using different headphones than normal.
Yep.
Fabulous, thank you. My experience has been when we've had young people who are, displaying disruptive behaviours in the school, is that those in charge have not been all that keen on implementing strategies to maybe decrease those behaviours, and have been pretty quick to remove them and expel them without the families being fully aware of the support that they could potentially be getting from the education department. How do we navigate that as a team? How do we educate families and advocate for them to be able to remain in school?
It's such an important question, Samantha. And, I say this with a lot of compassion for classroom teachers who have, incredibly challenging jobs. They're not trained on how to deal, with challenging behaviors in the classroom. The pedagogy when, you study education has a very limited window on things like, impact of trauma and development and, how to work with children who might not learn in a, a neurotypical way. And so, teachers come to the classroom with very few tools in their toolbox, very few skills. And the system reflects that. It's getting better in Victoria with investment in mental health and other forms of support for families who are, in challenging situations. But you're right that a lot of it depends on the school's appetite to facilitate supports, to get practitioners on site to support the classroom. And, for better or worse, sometimes the easiest mechanism for the school, and I guess, again, with kindness, who also has a duty of care to the other children in the classroom, to the teacher, to have a safe, healthy and working environment for the teacher. The only mechanism that they can see they can reasonably access is excluding that child. And so, again, I think this is about system reform from, properly training teachers to respond to the fact that we have really, really high numbers of traumatized children within the education system, all the way up to, enabling leadership and ensuring that they have, they really act on that responsibility to make sure that every kid has equity of access to education, and then making the funding by government match the demand. So it's not an easy answer. Again, whole of system reform is often needed to get a better response for these kids.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your insight.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Claire. That whole system reform is exactly the challenge, but music to my ears. Look, I might just take chair's privilege and ask a question as well. One thing that made my ears prick up when you were presenting was saying that the specialist family violence system can be the first touch point for these children. And I'm mindful that that first touch point might also be out of home care, for example. And so we have the Pathway to Good Health program in Victoria to try to respond to some of their needs. And then, of course, the first touch point might be youth detention. And you identified that gap that the program at the moment very sensibly thinks of a family unit. And so you need a safe caregiver to be part of that dynamic. Do you have any thoughts at this stage about how you might adapt or modify this approach so that it can work for those situations where children don't have those safe caregivers?
So the group work with peers has been really critical, especially for the children where mum, is really traumatized, has less capacity to do that relational repair. And while, it's not the same as having a safe caregiver that can provide that level of secure attachment, it is, a reasonable alternative. So we're looking at a model that works on peer support and peer-led groups, especially older victim survivors and that kind of peer support model is across the system. It's really, really beautiful. And, just like that story about the little boy I told, it shows the kids that there is hope for the future and for, their capacity as an adult to have a healthy life. And so the model that we're exploring is based around group work with children, probably a little bit of individual therapeutic work, though, noting that on the evidence base, that's actually not very effective for these kids, like having that one-on-one kind of very adulty sit-down chat therapy. So it would be really grounded in group work and peer-led work. But we're still in the very early days of exploring that via our expert panel.
Yeah, thank you. It's a complex but really important work as well.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments for Claire? Lindsay, third by the chair. Go.
Sorry. Like I said, I have a list of questions. This one's a little half-baked. I'm not sure where to go with this one too much, but I'm wondering if, and it's kind of straying away from the victim, but towards the perpetrator. And in terms of what might be happening then on the side of, I don't know, addressing the perpetration of violence. And we also know that young or adverse childhood experiences having a parent involved in the justice system or separation from a parent, obviously that might be a better outcome than having them in the home. But I'm just wondering, yeah, what your thoughts are around that and what's being done on the perpetrator end to kind of end that cycle of violence and remediate some of the harm that has been done. So there
Yeah.
potentially can be another parent in the future that is supportive. And as you mentioned, a lot of people that are victimized end up being perpetrators. So ending that cycle
Yeah.
is so important, but obviously very complex.
It is a really challenging space, and I think most of the men's behavioural change programs, at least in Victoria, are court mandated. So it's based on a direction rather than actively consenting to being in a program, and often they're built around models of accountability and power and privilege, which is very important. Violence is gendered. However, when you're working with cohorts of people who have experienced, again, lifelong disadvantage, trauma, and violence, particularly as a child, the research increasingly shows that they're not necessarily very effective models to actually change behaviour. And so there's some really beautiful work coming out of a number of different organisations which kind of do address that power privilege, that gendered lens, but balance it with a trauma-informed approach. So understanding, again, if we want the behaviour to change, we have to use effective interventions. And men's behaviour change programs are often delivered, in a room of men who don't want to be there, delivered by a stranger, and they're asked to talk about, accountability and really vulnerable moments, in their life in a group of strangers. And I mean, even you and I sitting listening to that, I don't think that is going to really help anybody change their behaviour. But there's really, really cool work happening, trying to address trauma and the drivers of violent behaviour, and the nexus between that and trauma. This is exactly what our program is doing. We're just trying to do it early before the violent behaviour escalates. And I think, again, even if you're kind of very, very clear that accountability is critical, and it is, because, using violence is still a choice. People might not have the same range of choices as you or I, but it's still a choice. However, we need to address the trauma and the drivers of that dysregulation, that explosiveness, that need to control, that need to punish that often perpetrators have. Your other question was kind of around whole of family responses, and there have been some really wonderful programs, including by organisations like Family Life down here in Victoria, which look at a whole of family model. It's not going to be appropriate for everybody because sometimes the risk of serious injury or death is just far too high, and you do need to remove the perpetrator from the family home. But like I said before, most victim survivors want to stay. They want to stay at, not just with the person that they love, but they want to stay at home in their communities. And if you can get the family to consent, whole of family intervention can be really effective. But again, it doesn't work for everybody. But more and more, those programs are showing a lot of promise. There's also a couple of really interesting models where the person using violence is actually removed. So that was a model, I think, in South Australia, where again, it had to be consent-based, which kind of, limits who will engage. But the PUV was the one who went to refuge, and mum and the kids stayed home. And so they were taken off-site, given therapeutic intervention, behavioural counselling, all of that, and returned home when there were enough indicators of behavioural change. So there are other models that are about keeping the family together, but they're definitely not the primary model in Australia. Did that answer your question, Sensi? Sorry.
Yeah, certainly did, and even more than I could have ever imagined. So thank you. It's an area that I don't have a lot of knowledge in, so it's really interesting just to hear you share that. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Claire. Samantha again.
Sorry, it doesn't stop over here. This kind of goes on from Lindsay's question. We've had a few NDIS participants that we've supported who have been court ordered to engage in the men's behaviour change program, and our experience has been that it doesn't work because they're required to go, but then they have to attend in order to be present and to go through that intervention. Have you got any statistics on the individuals who are perpetrating family violence in regards to AOD or substance use issues and disabilities in terms of what may be impacting those behaviours and presentations?
And just harking back to my work in the prison system, I can't remember any exact data, but the long story short is, yes, there's significant correlation and the rates are really high. Interestingly, also in victim survivors, the rates of drug and alcohol use, neurodiversity, and other forms of disability are very, very high. But that corresponds to, I think, just the population data around the intersection of disadvantage in our community. So, it's like we say, in our system, nobody ever presents just with one issue. It's always multiple intersecting disadvantage, which is compounded to, result in some sort of system intervention. But there's some really beautiful research about the prison system and people who intersect with the prison system, which I'm really happy to send on to you, Samantha, which shines a lot more light than I could on that.
Please send me all the things because I am a little bit of a nerd and I will enjoy the read.
I love nerds. As one.
You're in a safe space for nerds here, Samantha, that's for sure.
I have never felt so comfortable.
Claire, could I just pick up on something you said before? You were talking about, children in school and people might just see the naughty behavior of the child and not see this broader context. And I wonder if I could just invite you to reflect on, if we go forward to the youth justice system in the context of, this new violence reduction unit that's funded to adopt a public health approach. Because it seems to me that the youth justice system, almost by definition, in its current form, does exactly what you're describing in schools. It sees a naughty child engaging in behaviours, and the system response, is hyper individualistic in many ways. I wonder if you can just reflect as well as the programs that you're delivering on the policy opportunities to try to reframe how we think about those behaviours.
That's a great question. I think we have behaviour is politicised in all of Australia, and it's become a political hot topic, which makes it very, very difficult. And, both parties have learned, leveraging things like youth crime and crime rates as a very powerful political opportunity. And if you link that to, we're going to get more cops on the road and we're going to get more people in prison, they'll win votes and they follow through on their policy initiatives. So there's a bit of a wicked social problem kind of embedded in all of this, because the public has been incentivized to want to punish people. And I think the other thing that we don't really have good public conversation on, and then that translates into policy, is understanding children's brains, children's development, children's ability to understand the consequences of their actions. And we now know, that it takes the brain a really, really long time to develop, and the bits of our brain that can do things like understand the consequences of our decisions or, regulate our behavior or become less reactive, they keep developing well into our 30s, but we have a justice system that's built on imprisoning children as young as 10. And so where we've got youth justice, which is, I don't want to say good, but it's good that we recognize that children and young people have different needs, and their offending is different to older people. But it's still punitive. It's still based on punishment and incarceration and removal from the community. And that is embedded across all those justice responses and continues into the adult custodial system. And so I think the foundational work needs to be understanding the impact of trauma, understanding how trauma affects our development, all the stuff we've been talking about today, but embedding those evidence-based responses into youth justice, but with a focus on justice avoidance. So your very, very last resort is locking a child up. But again, that's a political conversation, which makes it very, very difficult. Again, whole-scale reform.
Thank you so much, Claire. You said that so well. Look, we're almost out of time, but I might just see if we can quickly get to Dino and then Samantha for a couple of last questions or comments.
Yeah, I'll flick mine to you by email, Claire.
Okay, cool.
All right, Samantha, it sounds like the last.
Wayne, your comments have been so good. Can't see
Thank you, Wayne.
your comments.
They've been really good. I think the experience that we've had in the youth justice system, it is very disability specific because that's the space that I work in. But what I'm seeing is that young people, once they have gained access to the youth justice system, what they've really been looking for is connection. And they've found connection and family and support in the criminal justice system, which has then led to them continuing to offend because the level of structure that they receive when they do go into the youth justice system is far higher than what they have when they're in the community. And that's where all their friends are.
Yeah.
So why would they want to come back into a community where they have no connection, they have no familiar support, and they've just got adults who are telling them that they're children and that they should be behaving as such when they've been on the street? They have done things that I could not even comprehend.
Yeah, it's such a
What's
good.
their reason to stay out?
So, like, I often reflect, just like, just globally, we expect children to behave that we would never expect ourselves, right? The level of regulation and kind of like rule taking, and it's just extraordinary, just for your average child. But there's one kind of thing that came to mind when you were talking, Samantha. I met with the team who are doing the Falcon Project by Berry Street, which is working with adolescents using violence in a therapeutic model. And they were talking about the really high rates out here in the Northwest of kids being targeted by criminal groups. And they talked about the reason that these kids are attracted to these groups. And it's often because that's the first time an adult has ever shown a genuine interest in them. It's relational. They've been, often like just sidelined by so many adults their whole life, and suddenly here's an adult who's interested, is relational, talking to them as a person, and they're so vulnerable and they're so lonely, and so they're pulled into criminal enterprises, with the promise of relationship. And that's really devastating, right? Again, this is a failing of multiple systems. And so you're absolutely right, that these kids go into these systems isn't because they want to offend. It isn't because they want to do the wrong thing. It's often because that is the only relationship, not a safe relationship, but relationship that they've been offered that's meaningful. And that's, again, another social failing.